Hey, film friends, I'm Nick Furman. This is Furman on Film, a podcast where we break down movies with some of my closest friends and special guests. This week we tackle Dario Argento's 1977 masterwork of Italian giallo horror, Suspiria. Well, today, guys, I have a very special guest. Nathan Bartlebaugh is a podcaster, former film critic, and member of the Washington, D.C. Film Area Critics Association. He's written for the Film Stage, DC Examiner, and has hosted podcasts like Pop Culture Ninja, Phantom Galaxy, and what will be particularly meaningful for us today, Horror Movie Podcast. So, it is Nathan Bartlebaugh. Welcome, man. Welcome to the podcast. We're so glad to have you today, man.
Me too, man. Thanks for inviting me, Nick. I'm really excited to talk about the movie. So,
Yeah. Well, let's jump in. Okay. So here's where I was like, you know what? How do we start this? How do we start this amazing thing? Here's where I'm going to start. The tagline or something from the film's promotional material. The only thing more terrifying than the last 20 minutes of this film are the first 92. So, as you and I started dialoguing about this, it became clear to me this dude has seen a lot of Argento movies, a lot of
yeah,
Argento.
that's true. I've seen a lot of movies in general.
Yeah, oh yeah, of course. But so we started dialoguing a little bit, and I was like, "Hey, I want to have you on, man. What do you want to do?" And you threw out some great stuff we may come back to, like "Don't Look Now," Nicholas Roeg's movie. And we landed on this one. So I just wanted to start by kind of giving you the floor a little bit, to maybe talk about your love for Argento, and if yeah, I think if you want to help me contextualize the larger genre of Italian giallo, I
Yeah,
think it's
yeah,
I
that's
think
fine.
I think it's worth taking a few minutes to give everyone like a little history lesson here because it matters and doesn't matter with regard to Suspiria, and we'll kind of tease that out a little bit. Yeah, so
So
I'm
the
not.
funny thing about the Argento and being a big fan of Argento is except for this film, I had not seen any of Argento's movies up until 2021. And what
Really?
happened is I've always been a big sci-fi fantasy guy, and I've always enjoyed horror, but it wasn't up until about the past 5 or 6 years where I really started to get back into horror. And again, with like horror movie podcasts, and there's other podcasts out there, Land of the Creeps, and becoming a part of that community of people, I
Yeah.
realized, kind of rediscovered my love of horror. And then I got COVID in 2021. And before that, I started to pick up some of Argento's movies because they're kind of putting out one of the great things I think about physical media now is all of these sort of boutique companies doing really nice restorations of these movies that for years we probably saw, in sort of fuzzy or grainy copies on TV or something like that. And
Yeah.
so I accumulated a bunch of them and I was banished to the basement where I watched about seven. I don't know if Italian horror film is exactly what I needed, feeling, sort of loopy and out of it, but that's what I did. So it became really interesting. And I know, Nick, you watched a few of these movies too.
Yeah.
It's neat to watch his evolution as a filmmaker, Argento in particular, how this movie fits into it. The reason I picked this movie didn't have as much to do with Italian giallo, but my thought process is a lot of times when I talk about movies as a critic, you spend a lot of time talking about what the movie is about, and particularly if the movie's really dense plot wise or drama wise, you spend a lot of time talking about those elements. So Suspiria is not really that kind of movie. It feels really like I would almost define it as a pure movie. It come in the sense that a pure
Yeah.
movie to me is something that could almost not be any other sort of medium, meaning that
Right.
it couldn't really be just a story. It wouldn't be quite as good. It wouldn't be good as just the images, all the images are amazing. And the
Right.
Goblin score, you can totally listen to on your own. I played it out in the yard on Halloween, actually.
Dude.
But when
Yeah,
they're
we're
all
coming. We're
combined
gonna come
together,
back
I
to that
think
one.
that's a completely unique experience. And it came out in 77. There's probably more, but there's three movies off the bat to me that come off as pure movies from 77. One, of course, is Star Wars. That's again
Yeah.
the perfect, it really can't be anything else. In fact, throw pinball games in there and you've got, all the elements. And then a movie that probably isn't talked about much at all, although I think it's very underrated, is William Friedkin's Sorcerer,
Yeah.
also from
Sorcerer.
77.
Yeah. Great
And
flick.
they just feel like pure movies. You're in the moment, you're in this completely realized world, and it's almost like you could forget to breathe with all three of these movies because the real world around you is sort of doesn't matter in the moment. And I think that's because they take fantasy and Sorcerer's not a fantasy, even though it sounds like it should be, but it immerses you in this world that doesn't feel real. It feels surreal because of the situation those guys are in. And I won't say more about that movie because I'd like to talk about it down the line sometime.
Well, we should, especially given that it's like a remake of Wages of Fear, basically.
That is, yeah, it is a
So,
remake of Wages of
so
Fear.
yeah, yeah,
But
we should do
and
that
both
one.
are great movies in their own right. But I guess so back
Exactly.
to Suspiria is what's interests me is how that movie it really feels like a dream. And you can say that about a lot of movies, but it's a
Yeah.
movie where, and I think you and I were having the same experience. You don't really remember it correctly. Like when you
Right.
go back
Right.
to it, there are lots of movies I could, I'm sure you have the same. I've seen them dozens of times. I've seen Suspiria several times, but I can never remember it exactly right. And
Right.
I think that's a very interesting thing with a movie because most movies, I have a pretty good memory. I can say this is how the scene was set up. But I go back to Suspiria, even I watched a few scenes yesterday after rewatching this and rewatching the remake and being like, wait, I think I watched that either completely wrong or remembered it wrong. So I
Yeah.
think that's a pretty interesting thing for a movie to be able to do.
Yeah. No, that's great stuff, man. Great stuff. So, I think we were kind of teasing this out, like Italian Giallo, right? I mean, it's this distinct film movement that starts in the 60s, gains international popularity through the 70s. We're talking 77 here. And it's named for the Italian word for yellow because you would have these like trashy, pulpy crime novels that were popular at the time. So, and as you and I were discussing, it's like it does sort of blend genres, right? I mean, we were talking about there's some mystery there, there's some horror there, there's thriller elements there. Um, and I think what was interesting for you and I was talking about how Suspiria kind of is, in some ways, it's like, I feel like most people I've talked to, it's like that is the example par excellence of the movement. And yet it's like not even really
No, it's
exactly
almost
within
like his
it.
frustration with the movement or his desire to move beyond the movement. So he
Right.
makes a different kind of movie. But you're right, and yeah, those yellow covers, and they always had like a. Usually they had a uh, sexy woman on the cover and then
Yes.
yellow background.
Right.
And although the Suspiria poster is not like that at all, it's a very that poster you mentioned with the tagline. That's a creepy
Yes.
poster
Right.
in and of itself. And down here in Baltimore a few years ago, I didn't get to go to it. I don't want to go so bad. They did a screening of this movie with the Goblin soundtrack
Sick.
live, and I wanted to see it. But some guy took his poster and he got it signed by Goblin, so he has that poster signed.
Ah, wow.
But the Giallo, the first Giallo came in about 1963, I think, and it was Mario Bava that was
Bava. Yeah.
working prior to Argento, but then they become contemporaries. They are contemporaries, but he ends up his films that come after Argento gets into the Giallo game are similar to Argento's stuff. But his first one, it came in like I think it was 63, and after that, Argento
Huh.
comes back and does Bird with the Crystal Plumage
Right.
in
Seven.
somewhere there, like 1960 something.
Yeah.
And I have my notes have gotten away from me. But
Well, the Bava flick was The Girl Who Knew Too Much, right?
yeah, The
Was
Girl
that
Who Knew Too Much. And Bava made several others like that Bay of Blood and things
Bay of
like
Blood?
that.
Yeah.
And
Black
some
Sabbath.
of
Yeah.
those also have been, Bay of Blood has also been credited as being sort of a proto slasher as well, in
Hmm.
addition, because Giallo and slasher aren't the same. But the main thing that differentiates Giallo, I think, is exactly what you mentioned, Nick, is the crime or mystery element of it.
Right.
And that's what's kind of weird about Suspiria is that the mystery elements of some of our when Argento gets into the Giallo game, he makes Bird with the Crystal Plumage,
Right.
and it sort of turns a lot of Giallo elements on their head by being so complex, even being
Right.
more complex in a sense than your average Giallo because it sets you up to think one thing. It plays a lot of sleight of hand. It kind of has like a stage magician thing going on. The same thing with Deep Red, where he's playing a lot of games with the audience that a Giallo movie a lot of times wouldn't be that different from a Hitchcock movie, right? You've got plot
Right.
turns and twists and things like that. But I think Argento would take that another level. There's some moments in Deep Red where he sort of cuts away to stories that could almost be a whole nother movie. Did you
Yeah.
watch? Did you
Right.
rewatch Deep
I
Red?
did. Yeah. Just this
There's a
last week.
moment where
Yeah.
one of the characters is trying to research something, and he ends up meeting this guy who has a little girl that likes to torture animals, and you're
Yeah.
like, it doesn't really lead into anything.
Right,
It's
right.
almost like its own separate movie. Like we could come back and make a movie about her someday.
Yeah, I think it's supposed
Uh,
to be kind of a
that's a
red herring given the initial images of the boy. But yeah, it's definitely like, wait, we could go
right.
down
So
this
he's
lane for
very tuned into plot in those
yeah,
films and knowing how to mess with it. And in Suspiria, he makes a very, it's a, both a very simple plot, almost to the point where it just evaporates
yeah,
towards the end of the movie. It almost just disappears, and you feel sort of rudderless. You're like, oh well, where did the story go? It's
yeah,
sort
yeah.
of gone.
Yeah. No, I know, man. I think, I think what it's like, we hear the word horror, and so you think of Giallo as like the things we'll talk about, like atmosphere, color schemes, crazy Goblin or Ennio Morricone soundtracks and things like that. But I think the better antecedents are, like you said, it's Hitchcock, and then it's like De Palma in the 80s, and this idea of like black leather gloves and knives and first person POV killings and murder mysteries, stylized violence, and then yeah, you said it about the covers, this like layer of eroticism, which, Hitchcock was implicitly referencing that it gets more explicit as the Hays Code drops off and time goes on, right? So the to
Oh,
the
for
point
sure.
where
Yeah, right. By
to
the
the
time
point
you
where you
get to
get De
Frenzy, it's a
Palma and
very
Body
different ball
Double,
game.
yeah, you get De Palma and Body Double being like, yeah, I'm just gonna make a softcore porn, So like,
Almost, yeah.
yeah, but until the studio is like, no, you can't do that, man. So, but man, so yeah, like you hit it, man. There's gothic horror elements which we're gonna get to, and if you're thinking noir as we're talking about this, I think you're not far off, right? I mean, that's definitely there. I mean, we mentioned Mario Bava, we mentioned Dario Argento, Lucio Fulci comes in, he makes the Gates of Hell trilogy and some other stuff
Yeah, and
like
Fulci
that.
was far more. I think what Fulci springs off of, and Fulci's career. Fulci's a really interesting guy because he has almost every kind of genre movie to his name. He made kids movies about dogs before and westerns before he made horror films, and he had a lot of personal tragedy happen in his life that sort of pushed him. His film filmography got much darker.
Hmm.
But his, like you mentioned, his Gates of Hell and his movie The Beyond, it's almost
Oh
just like
yeah.
a random image generator of the worst horror tropes you can imagine, of fears and things like that.
Yeah.
He follows the Suspiria model. Fulci doesn't do as much with the Giallo, where he really takes the Italian supernatural horror into like a whole nother realm.
Right. Yeah, I think and I think that's what we're kind of dancing around, but what we're trying to say is in terms of, sorry, I'm just pulling up the Beyond here. Yeah, calling Fulci the godfather of gore. I mean, the Beyond
That's
is
probably, if you've
it
seen
is
Beyond, you can kind of get down with
it's
that.
an awesome flick, but like people that are like Suspiria or Deep Red or violent pictures, I'm like, you you got to see the Beyond. Some of these other stuff, man, or
Yeah,
it's
I'd
not
almost
like
make
a
the
Henenlotter
case,
flick.
right. I don't want to say that they're not violent pictures,
No, they are,
but
but
in some ways their violence in its impact on the audience, I think, is similar to the impact of even Hitchcock violence.
yeah,
Uh, Hitchcock has to put the blood in black and white in Psycho, obviously,
right.
but Argento goes the other way and makes it as red as possible,
Yes.
redder than this wall behind me.
Yes.
And my daughter, I think you mentioned too that I don't know if this is making us have to look like bad parents or not, but you mentioned you watched this with your 10-year-old. I watched it with my 10-year-old,
Yeah.
and she saw the blood and she thought that's really cool. Not that it was blood, but how abstract it was. It really
Right.
was like
Yeah.
paint, and he didn't seem to. It's not that he doesn't care. He makes it look like paint. I mean, it's viscous. It's not dripping everywhere. It's just a giant pool.
Right.
And it's always like sort of artistically framed around the head.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting thing that he makes it so stylized that I don't think of Suspiria as being particularly violent, even though
No.
that initial death, even my daughter goes, that might be overkill.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. There's like that's all part of this sort of like gothic horror thing that makes Suspiria what it
Yeah.
is, right? So it gets away from like strictly the murder mystery elements, and this is when Argento kind of dips into supernatural. So you get this, and then Inferno, the follow up, which is bonkers, and then he kind of dials it back into these more giallo things. But I think like the haunting gothic imagery. Maybe we should transition to that, like the visuals, the
Yeah.
scoring. there's like this beauty and brutality kind of walking hand in hand, and the amazing framing of shots. And so like I think that's what you're kind of teasing, where you get these like kill scenes, but they're somehow like painterly and picturesque, you know? It's
Yeah,
like,
it's almost impossible. We keep talking like we're teasing, but it's almost impossible to talk about any aspect of this movie without talking about the fact it is just made to be sensory. It's really meant
yeah,
to be like a moving piece of art, which is different than a lot of
agree.
films. I think one of the movies I mentioned when you were asking me, hey, what do you want to do? I think one of the movies I mentioned was Alex Proyas's Dark City.
Yeah,
And I
yeah,
always remember Roger Ebert kind of like going nuts for that movie and saying, he had a couple things he said. One of the things he said was that when you watch Dark City, you realize that a lot of movies are just about two people talking to each other. And Suspiria and Dark City are not that kind of movie. And he also quoted, and many times he would quote Werner Herzog saying that we live in a world that's starved for new
yeah,
images.
yeah,
And I think that's true. And sometimes when we watch some of these films, they build up and they build up, promising you're going to get to something great. In terms of being starved for images, movies like Suspiria start feeding you right from the very first scene. Like
yeah,
it's right off the bat, you're getting stuff.
yeah. It's true. It's true. Yeah, I was gonna say, I mean, you've people that have made it 15 minutes with us and we haven't even hit the plot, but the opening is worth saying because so just really simply, Suspiria is the story of Susie Banyan, who's an American dancer who's arriving at this mysterious ballet academy in Germany in the middle of the night, right? And then I think it's safe to say weird crap starts happening. It's people start dying, strange occurrences. And we start wondering if there's something shady about the folks who are in charge. Not particularly new plot wise, but rich in atmosphere and mystery. But you said it, man. I don't often do this up front, but Goblin, baby, like, dude, Goblin, the first, just if you don't want to, if you're not a horror fan, if you don't want to put this on, I get it. Just watch like the first 7 minutes of this movie, man. It's
Yes,
almost
agreed.
entirely wordless. The score is just propulsive and discomforting and so in your face, man. And she's trying to get to this place. There's this girl going through the woods. There's this driving rain. There's a German cab driver who's like just sort of off-putting, and like that's it. Like you said, man, from like moment one, it's like the sound is constantly drawing your attention as its own character, uh, and basically, um, you know, it just blows me away every time. I mean, you got like there's synths. You mentioned it when we were talking about it. There's like
Yes.
screaming characters in the background, like they're like Suspiria and like
And witch, just
yeah,
witch.
witch, witch, witch. You
It's
know,
not it's
like
not subtle at all.
yeah,
People walking around
yeah,
my
so
house
on the
hearing the
nose.
screams of witch coming out of the yard. It's like, but the one other genre or medium that we didn't really mention that was a part of Giallo, and then Argento bumps it way up for this movie is opera.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Like the Italian opera really plays into this movie, not plot wise because it's ballet. Actually, there's very little ballet in this movie, particularly
Right.
compared to the remake. The remake was like, well, it's a ballet. We need to have some actual ballet.
Yeah, let's have some
You don't even
dancing. Yeah.
see the Jessica Harper character that you mentioned actually
Right.
do ballet because she's hurt her leg.
Right.
She
Right.
doesn't.
Right.
We never actually see her do ballet. There's a few ballet scenes, but so the reason I mention the opera is it's the synchronicity, I think, Nick, that drew us in and makes it notable because so few movies have that synchronicity. Like that shot you're talking about when you see her get, and that's the other thing. Are we spoiler podcast here? What are we?
Yeah, let's just say if from woo woo like you
Okay, it's
if you
I
want no
guess it's
spoilers,
minor, but
then
yeah, let's put the woo woo.
the
About
bumper.
5 to 6 minutes into this movie, my daughter says, "Wait, is this one of those movies where you follow one character and then you end up following someone else?" And I'm like, "Yes, it is."
Yeah.
So that because you do meet. It's interesting how they introduce you to the lead character right up front, but it's in a passing thing, right? It's almost like a Tarantino thing where she's going in and the other girl's coming out, and
Oh,
we
right.
follow someone else. Uh, and that ride, I think, is one of the great shots in cinema where she's in that cab and it goes through a woods and it looks like a fairy tale woods, right? It
Yeah, it
looks like
does. You're right.
something Little Red Riding Hood would go through. And I probably a quick mention that uh Argento is mentioned, and there's a couple mentions on the like I have the 4K here. I don't work for Synapse, but I do recommend this. It's a
There it
lot of
is.
great special features. And you have Argento talk at one point. He talks about how a huge influence, like when he saw Snow White and the Seven Dwarves and Disney movies. In fact, in Italy, the 1940s Pinocchio was considered a horror movie by some, a kid's horror movie, but a horror movie.
Yeah, yeah,
He
yeah.
wanted to make a film that captured in its visuals and its colors a fairy tale the way Disney did. And in some ways, Suspiria is a really, really dark Disney movie. You can
Yeah.
look at those elements and they're there. But that shot, the Goblin score is perfectly synchronized with the way that car moves through the, and even the shadows. And it was it you, Nick, that mentioned like there's an image in the trees that almost looks like a knife or something. It was someone was telling me that like
Yeah.
when the problem is I talk movies with everybody,
No,
so
I
at
don't.
some
I don't
point
think it
I've
was
done
me, but I wish it was me. That sounds really
yeah,
profound.
someone pointed out they said, Nathan, does it look like when they're coming through the forest, it looks like there's the knife in the trees above it? I'm like, the image of
Mm.
the knife, and I look, I'm like, yeah, it kind of does. It has that. There is a lot of premonition sort of going on in the movie. Sometimes characters have actual premonitions, and the film itself, though, almost has premonitions. There's one point where some characters just start talking, and you're like, what are they talking about? And it turns out
Right.
talking about things will happen much, much later. But that scene, the music is synced perfectly to the images, and the cab shots and the reactions to the people inside the cab,
Yeah.
it's so organic that you don't even sit there and like you almost don't take full appreciation of it because it's done so flawlessly.
Yeah, so well said, man. And I think what always hit me about the mix, I mean, and you get it even more like he'll start doing synth scores and stuff with Goblin and like Deep Red and Tenebra's score is bonkers. Uh it's so loud in the mix in places, it completely overshadows. It's like, yeah, you can just tell. It's like the words aren't even as important sometimes to him, you know? But I think what you said about the fairy tale, the opera piece, the sort of the woods. I think that's worth talking about, man. Like the Gothic horror elements, like this film in particular, and I think a lot of the giallos are marked by like these vibrant colors, like reds, blues, the stylized lighting. Like you get this nighttime sort of flying vision thing, and like this red. You know what I'm talking about? Where it's like really just wild, man. And it's like I think his cinematographer is Luciano Tovoli would
Yeah,
do
he is amazing, an amazing job with this because every single shot
yeah,
when it most of the time when a movie does something like give us plot information every single shot we're amazed, but every single shot is integral to the atmosphere.
right,
And for a movie that's this ambient,
right,
I had my wife wasn't looking at it, and then she looked up and she said, "Oh, can you run it back?" And my daughter's like, "You didn't miss any plot." She's like, well, "I don't care about that. I just wanted to
right.
see how it looked."
Yeah. Well, that's just it. Like you said, man, it's like you can't miss any of this and be on your phone, but not because you're going to miss words, because you're going to miss shots and the combination of the visual and the sound. And
Right, which is that very
that's,
thing that makes me love movies. When I see a
yeah.
movie like this that just kind of goes for it, even if it may not be a perfect film, but it feels like the perfect use of the medium.
Yeah, exactly. Like you said, man, like it could have only been a movie. Like that's almost like the best thing to recommend it, right?
Yeah,
So, and you're right. I mean, I love that you said ambient because I do think that's the thing. This is a mood picture, an atmosphere. Those colors they heighten emotion, evoke emotion. They signify supernatural elements as the film progresses. And I think you mentioned it's a nightmare. Like there's a surreal quality to the whole thing that is like kind of inescapable, right? I mean, it's like
yeah. When I
what he's
watched
doing.
this, I watched it on the TV, but then I put it on the projector downstairs and blew it up to the size of the wall. That's exactly the way to watch it.
Oh, wow, that's awesome.
Because it's like it's so immersive. Since we're on the topic of the fairy tales, I just wanted to mention really quickly because we're right, there isn't a lot of plot to this, but there's a basic plot. There is a plot, but it is just kind of it's there as a clothesline to hang things on, really.
Hmm.
But this is based off of Argento does draw this from an actual like published thing by Thomas de Quincey in like 1845 called Suspiria de Profundis, which
Right, right.
was
Good
part of
point.
a book I think that was called what was it? It was Confessions of an English Opium Eater. So that should
Hmm.
give you a pretty good idea of where his headspace is when he
Right.
writes this. But he does talk about these three witches, which actually are drawn from even further back, like folklore. So these characters that Argento has at the center of ultimately three movies, but Suspiria and Inferno, when he's working with them, he
Yeah.
has a kind of a structure. He wants to cover these three characters, which are the three mothers, and the three mothers are there's Lavinia, who's the Lady of Sorrows,
Right.
and she is she's also the known as sort of the Mother of Tears, which is what the movie that is
The
about
third
her
one.
eventually is
Yeah.
called. And then there is the Mother Lacrimarum, which is the lady. She's the Lady of Tears. Master Suspirium is the Lady of Sighs. She's the one that this film is about. And
Right.
then the Mother Tenebrarum is the Lady of Darkness. Now, strangely, he's got a movie called Tenebrae, but it has
Yeah.
nothing to do with the Lady of Darkness. Lady of Darkness is in Inferno. So he has these three witch characters, which is interesting because it's like the mothers they're not that far off from being the witches that might appear in, like, say, the Wizard of Oz, right, where they
Right.
each
Right.
have their own sort of established realm that they deal in, and mythologically speaking, they all can interact with each other and combine together. They're sort of the end of the world, right? They're sort of the apocalypse.
Hmm. Wow. Yeah, that's rich, man. That's I'm trying to think of what else, we kind of hit.
But how what's interesting, let's talk real quick about the fact that how much of that is mentioned in the film.
Right. Right.
There
Jeez,
are a
man.
couple of whispered discussions about the mother, the mother Suspirium, but not a whole lot because she is embodied by this other character that has a human name and everything like that. But the thing I want to mention about that is I think that's what the ambiance leads up to. He creates a world where witches can actually exist,
Right.
and that almost substitutes for the plot. Instead of giving us the backstory of the witches, he shows us a world that is sort of dominated by dark, unseen magic.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think if I was gonna end, if I do some themes and do some pros and cons, I think if I were gonna state a con of this film, and I think it's indicative of the time, but it wraps really quickly. Like there's a lot of setup, and then in
Yeah,
its
real
final
quick.
moments, it's like, and it's gone, and you're like, wait, what? Like, so
That's the part I forgot
yeah,
was what you said is like
yeah.
uh I'm like, wait, it's over
Yeah,
already?
right. So you're waiting for this big thing to come out and then it kind of is there and then boom, it's gone and now credits.
Which does lead a question. Read that quote from the poster again.
Yeah, yeah. No, I know exactly. Like the
Right? They only if the last 20 minutes the most terrifying, where'd they go? Because my
yeah,
cut here is 98 minutes
yeah,
long.
exactly. I think right. I know it's like some false advertising there. So, but I guess I think that's kind of almost it's almost Argento being like it never really was about the plot that much anyway. Um, it
Yeah,
was
although the ending is probably the most conventional part, right? Like
sure,
it's the Disney ending. Defeats the witch, place burns up, and
yeah, yep, yep. So I mean, yeah, and that's a good point. It definitely hits all of those touchstones. So, I was going to ask you if you thought there were any like real themes to tease out here, like or. I mean, you can kind of get in the weeds with it. It's the setting of a ballet academy, which is a place of discipline and, well, beauty, right? So we get the beauty versus these hidden layers of corruption and darkness. So you get that. Um, you get the feminine power and control stuff. I mean, is that there for you? Like the women as victims? Because I kind of wanted to tease that out in Tenebrae a little bit, where he basically kind of flies in the face of his critics there a little bit. But I don't know. What do you think, man? Are there themes that you always hit on or touch on or
No, and when I think you're hitting them. I think the themes are there and they're strong, but it's more like they're meant there to be the kind of like structure in the framework. They're supposed to add some texture to it. The feminism thing. Let's talk about that because you're right. You have women being murdered here, and that was.
yeah.
But there are men that are murdered in this film too. And there's that one
Yes.
scene with the blind man and the dog. really weirdly disturbing just because it kind of comes out of nowhere, right?
Nowhere.
You
Yeah,
almost don't
exactly.
expect it to happen.
Right.
A few years ago, I went to a Halloween party that one of my friends had, and he was showing movies in different rooms. And he took his elderly relatives and set them down in a room and turned Suspiria on and then walked out. And I walked back in as I think his 80-year-old grandmother was trying to figure out why the dog was attacking the blind man. That's an aside.
That's
The
great.
other aspect of this is that the hero and the heroine and the villain are both women.
Hmm.
And the standoff is you Dorothy versus the Wicked Witch in a sense. Like
Yeah.
there's that element where the feminine power that shows up in fairy tales, because fairy tales way before the final girl, it was all about the princess ultimately is the one most stories, the you got Snow White where she's woke, you have a couple where she's woken up, but she's still the primary character in the story. Now
Yeah.
here there's no prince who comes in, so he kind of gets rid of that part too, and she has to save herself.
Yeah. She's got it.
um,
Right.
so I think that the feminist aspect, if you want to talk about that, is this is Argento does place women more central. They're not just murder objects. In some of the giallos, they are there. They're there to be terrorized. They're there to be a part of suspense. Just as the hero male is getting close to finding the killer
Right.
usually shows up at his girlfriend's house or something, right? Like
Right.
there's a
Right.
couple of movies that they do that, and the women fight back, but they're not central. And so I think there's a distinct difference here in this film. I'm not saying it's full feminist or anything like that. I do think that's clearly an aspect of the remake. The remake is 100% going in that direction. But
Yes.
here, I think the other things that we can look at, and there are pieces on this uh, that talk about the turmoil in Europe, and you've got a movie made in the 70s coming out of in the not so recent past, you've had a lot of issues with fascism and things like that. And so the turbulent history of Europe, I think, is kind of played out here. Again, you've got these characters that are pulling the strings, like they're the dark shadow behind the world in a sense. And there are some of these scenes, I think some of the scenes in Argento movies that feel like they're the asides, the blind man and the dog and stuff like that. I think there's a weird part. Is it this film? Is a weird part where a guy just starts kind of like talking and you're listening to him talk
Hmm.
outside and you're like, what is this connected to? It's a weird existential moment. But I wonder if some of that is meant to, that these supernatural horrors are meant to sort of remind us in a vague way. Again, the remake makes it explicit. I think Argento's probably smarter by making, not smarter, but maybe a little wiser by keeping it in the background.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's good. Those themes are there. And right, like you said, they're in the background. So you could watch this as or some of the giallos as like almost prototypical slashers, or you can kind of dig in and find some richer content there.
Yeah, it's
So
almost like marinate. He's marinated them in themes, but he hasn't. He's not like making the theme
yeah.
glaze. He's not putting it right out there. And I think that's so those scenes, some of those individual scenes can just have power to be scenes. Like you and I were talking about. There's a scene involving like a person falls into a room full of basically
Yeah.
barbed wire,
Right,
big
right, right.
loops of it, but they look like springs. It looks like the most fun thing ever for about
Yeah.
20 seconds.
Yeah, I was like, I didn't even know it was razors, and then you made the
Yeah.
call back to Saw, or that Saw, the original Saw kind of calls
Right.
back to
Saw
that.
has a scene where you see someone
Yeah.
in a room sort of with all this razor wire. Now, but the minute that scene starts, and I personally don't like the way it's edited because it's got that MTV sort of like, whoa thing going
Yes.
on. And it's very high impact. It's meant to emphasize the brutal nature of the barbed wire
Sure,
and the
sure.
person getting hung on it. The weird thing here is he kind of takes that away. Like you said, it looks fun at first. Then you get that kind of suffocating feeling of like when you fall into a ball pit or something, you can't get out immediately, and she's trying to get out of it, and you're like, oh, that's bothersome. And then you realize that it is wire
Hmm.
and that it's lethal. And it's a very different approach where modern horror wants you to know right up front. It's not even like the Hitchcock of like the
Right.
suspense is building and the knife is coming. It's like you don't know that they're in danger until
Right.
it's halfway through.
Yeah, powerful, man. And that's the thing. Like, if you don't want to do the theme thing, the thematic thing, like we talked about the opening. They're just the kills in this movie are freaking cool.
Oh yeah, you kind of have to dig because the best way to do it
Yeah,
is just to sort of go with it.
yeah,
Like,
just watch it.
like
Just let it wash over you. Get into the ambiance, feel the sounds and colors, and
Yeah,
You
it's
know,
kind of like 2001 in that way. I
yeah, yeah,
remember
yeah.
someone saying that, like, in the 60s when that movie came out, after it had been out for a bit, the hippies would file in and lay on the floor and just stare up at it and say,
Yeah,
far out.
yeah, yeah,
And
exactly.
this, you could have just gone right over to the next theater and, Suspiria and 2001 would be an interesting back to back.
Wow, that'd be wow,
That'd be
crazy.
a lot.
Yeah, it sure would. Well, is there anything else, man, we missed? I know for the audience, we kind of popcorned around a little bit, but I think that's, pretty typical of the film where plot kind of
It is. It's hard.
makes
I
it.
mean, to talk singularly about the plot, it's so basic that you
Yep.
don't really get a vibe for it. And I kind of want, for people who haven't seen it, I hope that what we did was give them a sense that this is a ride.
Yeah.
It's something that you have to experience. If you're gonna watch it, don't watch it on your phone, and don't watch your phone while you're watching it.
Right.
See it on the biggest screen you can see it. If you've got a
Right.
great sound system, watch it because it's made for those things.
Yeah. Yeah. No.
As far as we were talking about things that detract from it. I think you hit it on the nail on the head, which is it just feels so slight in some ways. It feels
Yeah.
so
Right.
ephemeral that when it's over, you're left there thinking that's it, because he makes this world so rich. He could have gone on,
Yeah.
but if he had gone on, maybe it would feel a little more like a Giallo. It does wrap up, not unlike a Disney movie where you've had this wonderful, enchanting thing.
Right.
And maybe that's the key for some of these movies, Disney movies included. They're enchanting, but they don't feel completely satisfying. So you come
Right.
back and you come back and you come back.
Right. It's true. Versus the actual Giallo, you take the third act of Tenebra, which is just this naughty, complex thing that's moving all over the place, and it's this guy, no, it's that guy, and Deep Red's doing that too. So I think,
Yeah, you kind of feel like I can go a while before I watch that again,
yeah,
unless you rewind it just to figure out what you
right. You
you
need the
didn't.
10-second back button. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, because it's all over the place, right? So, and that whole labyrinthine thing is a part of the Giallo experience. Suspiria is not that. It's like images and sounds and some on the nose, which
Which is
is,
so impressive, I think,
but
for a director, because we
yeah,
see directors make movies in a specific mold all the time. The
yeah,
Wes Andersons, the Terry Gilliams, and Argento too. But for a director to take a movie, a very specific slot, and then make a movie that feels exactly like it, but is not like it at all,
hmm.
structurally, is pretty impressive.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think we've done a lot of stuff. We've talked about a lot of things. We jumped into Giallo, and I resisted the urge to try and take you down side paths to talk about Deep Red and Tenebrae and some of these others films that I just can't even wait to get to. But uh, before we give our final scores, is there anything we missed? Any other things you want to tease out or hit? I know we kind of jumped around, but just a lot of great stuff here to chew on.
No, not really. I think, remember that little message they always have at the end of like TV shows? Well, if you'd like to know more about Giallo, visit your local library or something, and
Yeah,
visit your local
right.
boutique. They've got a lot of, or streaming has a lot of these movies available, I think. I do think they're definitely worth seeing. And I do want to say something you mentioned about two or three times today, Nick, which I think is good to reiterate. I don't think you have to be a horror fan to like this movie.
No,
And I don't
no.
think you have to be a horror fan to like some of the Giallos either, because those films do function more as thrillers. They're very stylish. If you're a person, and I am, who really appreciates a visual feast, if you will, you really can't go wrong with a lot of these early Argento movies. I would say Deep Red and Tenebrae would be the other two that if you want to get a feel for his work and you want to see sort of the best of it, this one, Tenebrae and Deep Red.
Yeah, those I think that's you nailed it, man. And we were joking around about me watching it with my 11-year-old. It's like this movie could have been PG except for the suggest. I mean, there's no language, there's no sex. Like
Yeah,
it's violent, but the violence is yeah, I mean, it literally looks, the bathroom kill scene in Tenebrae is like it looks like someone has like heated up lipstick and poured it.
oh
It's
yeah,
like
it looks, and there's a scene
it's
here with a bisected face, and you're just sort of like, oh wow, that looks,
yeah,
my I
it's
think it
more
was
about
my
the
son who
positioning
pointed,
and
yeah, my son pointed out, you know what, Dad, how is this any more violent than the arm cut off in Star Wars? And
yeah, yeah,
that's a
yeah,
reasonable point. Like, it really,
right.
visually speaking, it doesn't look much worse than that.
No, no. So, I think, yeah, I was just looking over all my Giallo notes and seeing if we, the recurrent motifs, if we hit that, the fragmented storytelling, the masked killers. In this case, it's not a masked killer because it's not strictly that.
But
Is there?
he does put that in to begin with. He sort of lays it
Yes,
in, and I think
right,
that's the thing. He puts all the pieces you expect. So really, you think when this movie came out, it probably felt like a giallo for the first 20
right,
minutes.
right. That's true. That's well said. And the voyeuristic camera work is something you see more in other places where you get the like first person POVs and like I mentioned,
Yeah.
De Palma, Hitchcock, things like that. But excessive style. But I love that the idea. I just listening to a podcast about Body Double. So, and I'm just a big fan. And
That is
we,
such a good movie.
oh my gosh, I love
And
it.
Blowout even more so.
Yeah, it's like Blowout's probably his very best, and
Yeah.
Body Double is probably my favorite. But
That's a
um,
good way to put it. Yeah.
yeah, but just this idea that like you shoot things on film, you frame shots, you create things, and now you can be on your phone with so much of this stuff. It's shot digitally, it's people talking in rooms, and you can miss stuff, and it doesn't really matter. And in this case, I think what we're really most strongly trying to articulate is like this is cinematic, and you got to just let the visual feast happen. So.
These are
Uh,
guys that like operated more like painters than
yeah,
what we think of as filmmakers. I think lots of times modern filmmakers almost feel like they're, you know, just herding cats. You get all the
right,
pieces together and make sure
right,
they're there, and that the movie points are gotten out. And a lot of the really good filmmakers, I think we like a lot of them who aren't doing the painterly thing. It's because they put a lot of work into their scripts, which you
right,
should.
right,
But this is a good example of a film that doesn't depend upon that.
right. Well said. Yeah. So, all right, man, it's time. All my guests, I let them tap into the FOF score, which lets them do points and dots and all kinds of fun things. So, I'm gonna let you lead us off, Nathan. Like, what do you give Suspiria? What do you give that
Well, I
score?
guess I have to like take advantage of it. So let's give it like a poor 4.499999, like right at the end. I'll play your game.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, man. Do you want the little dot, the little
Yeah,
line
you
over it
can
for repeating
figure out
it?
where you want to cut it off at.
So right around 4.5 stars.
Yeah. But I think a 4.5. And there's I gushed about it, but there definitely are issues with it. It's not a perfect
I
film,
I agree.
but I think what it is it's a perfect use of film.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Very well said. And it could have, they could have teased a little more out, and I think Luca tries to do that in the remake.
Yeah,
With
and it's almost too much. You sort of see
Yes.
why Argento backed off.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. Like, I do not think that the new one is a poor film, but I do think that, less is more than when the more becomes too much. And I think that that's kind of where that one
There is too much. I'm actually a
it
whole
tips.
point lower on that
Yeah,
one.
me too, man. It tips the scale in that way for me.
Yeah,
So I had down 4.3 out of 5 stars,
nice.
very much like rounding up to 4.5 on the old letterboxed. Um, I think that this film could have been like the promotional. I think if this film's maybe 10 minutes longer, I like it a little more, especially if it makes the ending a little more punchy and like lets it linger. But again,
Right, there's not really a fight between the villain and the hero per
no.
se. That's kind of what we're missing, I think, is that traditional struggle.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like it's there, then it's bad, and then it's over. And you're like, okay.
Although, you know what dawns on me is that there was no final confrontation in Snow White either. She's
Yeah.
run off a cliff.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, that's like when it comes down to authorial intent, I'm sitting here listening to you talk about it and tease it out, and I'm like, yeah, this is 4.5. Like, what are you doing 4.3, Furman? So I'll tell you this, the first time I watched it, it was like 4. The second time it was like 4. Each time
It'll
I
be
watch
something
it,
different every time,
yeah,
right?
I like it a little more each time I see it,
Yeah.
honestly. But I think we're right on the same page. It's about a 4.5 star film. I think it's right in the sort of pantheon of Argento pictures.
Yeah, for sure. I put it right there. See, you got me questioning it now too because I can't. I'm not sure I figure out. I think I had it number one till I rewatched this one, Deep Red and
Yeah.
Tenebrae, and they're right neck and neck. But pretty, I think a movie's pretty special when it does get better each time you watch it.
Yeah, very, very well said, man. Well, hey, man, I thank you for coming. Thank all the
Hey, thanks for
listeners
having me on.
for
I
tuning.
finally had an excuse to break out this 4K
Yeah,
and
man, I
check it
love it.
out.
Hopefully, people are watching the video on YouTube. If you're not just catching the audio, we got this beautiful Synapse
Oh
4K
yeah, yeah. That cover is
physical.
pretty impressive too.
Ooh,
It's
yes, shout out Physical Media. And if you're one of those, semi-lost souls who only saw the Luca Guadagnino remake with Dakota Johnson, hop back into the original, man. Jump
Oh
in
yeah,
the
it's a completely different film. I
very
give the
different.
remake credit for kind of being its own thing and trying to tap into what Argento was doing, but they get mired in the mythology and then get
Exactly.
mired in the subtext that we talked about.
Yes.
That World War II Holocaust subtext that's just way down there is
Right.
bumped up to almost feature. There's almost too many movies in the remake.
That's just it. It could have been two flicks, yeah.
Yeah.
So, so step back. I think it's on Prime right now, or I watched it. It's
I'm
on a
not sure if
streamer.
the is the original on Prime.
I think
I
so.
know the remake is on Prime. I think they
Yeah.
both are, and I would recommend if you haven't seen either one, watch both, but watch the original first.
First, yeah.
And if you haven't, if you've only seen the original, I do recommend watch it because there are some pretty crazy scenes in the
There
remake
there
too.
definitely are some good
Yeah,
visual. I
there's a
mean,
particular kill in the remake that's wild. I mean,
yeah.
it's not like anything Argento did, but it's wild.
Yep. All right, I think that wraps it up.
Yeah,
We could go on Giallo for hours, but this will hopefully, wet your whistle to check out some more Argento flicks and the entire larger context of Italian Giallo filmmaking. So I want to thank you again for Nathan for coming in and giving me all your expert thoughts. And so I'm Nick Furman. This is Furman on Film. Stay firm, my friends.